tonight we have C.V. Smith. He's written a number of books. For many years, he taught at SMU, and we're so glad to have him. He's now written Girl Flees Circus. So it's my honor to introduce C.V. Smith, and afterwards, we'll take questions from the audience.
Thanks, Tom, for having me here to talk about Girl Flees Circus. And thank you for coming out. It's incredible what you went through to get here. I'm very impressed with your hardiness and your willingness to kind of brave these elements to go through this. I'd like to talk just a little bit about what the book is, a sort of summary of the book, and then I'd like to talk about the origins of the novel. And then I'll read very briefly, and then you can ask me anything that might occur to you to ask me. Girl Flees Circus is a story about what happens to the inhabitants of a sleepy one-street village in the southeast corner of New Mexico when, in September of 1928, and literally out of the blue, a young female aviator has to make an emergency landing in a stolen, open cockpit biplane, and the damage caused by the accident requires her to stay several days to make repairs. And in the meantime, her life becomes entwined with the lives of locals. We have a lonely young school marm originally from Ohio, whose Model T, the pilot, narrowly avoids crashing into, a handsome boyish mechanic and jack of all trades eager to help our aviator repair her plane, a former World War I nurse who serves as the village's only medical provider, and her husband, whose war injuries of shell shock and poison gas have led him to take up farming out here, and a biracial couple in their 60s who fled the oppressive Jim Crow laws in Texas to live quietly as the owners and operators of the hamlet's only cafe and blacksmith shop. The longer the young pilot stays, the more events are the catalyst for changes in herself and the people she has altogether unexpectedly met. It sounds a little bit unlikely on the surface of it, but what happened was when I was about 12 and I grew up in this small town in southeastern New Mexico, Hobbs, someone said, well, Amelia Earhart had once made an emergency landing right here in Hobbs. I thought it was unlikely because this town was so isolated, so separate and apart from anything having to do with any kind of celebrity. And I knew at that time that she was a celebrity. I thought, well, that's, must be a apocryphal story. It couldn't be very likely. So I just let it sit in my head for maybe 55 years until finally I decided I was going to track it down and find out what I could about whether or not it was true. It turned out to be very easy to find out because in June of 28, 2 months before this, she had become in the press someone known as the first woman pilot to fly across the Atlantic. And I know that conjures up images of Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis flying solo across the Atlantic. And in some degree it was, only there were 3 people in the cockpit along with she and another pilot and a navigator were there. So she assisted and she flew some part of the plane and she, doled out crackers to the navigator or whatever. But she became an instant celebrity. And so when she came back to the United States after that trip, every newspaper in the country decided they needed to do a story about her. At that time in America, the means of communication was almost solely through newspaper. There were radio stations, of course, but every newspaper had to have copy, and every town, even Waxahachie had 6 newspapers. So every town had a lot of newspapers, and they were all eager to write about her. So that trip was advertised very widely in all these newspapers. At the same time, she had a professional and personal relationship with George Putnam of the Putnam publishing industry. And he was very eager to promote her career and to assist her and to support her through his money and through his marketing ability. So they decided that what she needed to do next was to take a cross-continental trip by herself in an open cockpit biplane. And even though she might have his support and she might be having people track her, it was a very daunting thing to do because those airplanes were not very reliable. Their range was not very great. They had no electronics. They had no lighting. Airfields were few and far between. So when you took off at dawn and you started flying, when the light ran out, you were going to have to find a place to land, and it wasn't always very convenient to find a place to land because there might not be one except for a field or a road or wherever you could find to set down safely. So she set out on that trip, and George's idea was that he was going to call ahead and he was going to contact people in the towns that she was supposed to be in. Say, well, Amelia Earhart's going to be landing in your town, and you go out and meet her and greet her. And so she would be supposedly put up in houses and homes of people that she ran across, and she would be talking to Rotarian groups and ladies' clubs and the like. It was very hard to schedule this, however, because of the kind of event that this happened on the second night. She was landing in Pittsburgh, and the landing gear hit a rut, and the plane ground looped, broke the propeller, and broke the landing strut. And so she needed to have that plane repaired. Now, George, parts for repair for that aircraft were few and far between, so he had actually bought another aircraft just like it so that he could use that plane for spare parts. So he went ahead and did that. So she eventually did make her way across the states and did wind up making an emergency landing in Hobbs, New Mexico. And here she is, a picture of men gathering around trying to gas her up as she was getting ready to leave Hobbs. And this is the grocery store where they gassed her up in the town. So I got interested in her career, and this was maybe one of the many, many stories about her stop there. You'll notice that she's very famous here for donning overalls while she's repairing her plane at Toyah. So she stopped there in Toyah, and then the night previous she had got off her course and landed at Lovington, New Mexico, which is near Hobbs. And then she went on to fly, and she claims that she didn't have any particular destination in her trip, and she might as well just enjoy it as a kind of a jaunt or a joyride. And this is what she said when she finally got to Los Angeles. I started out on just a little vacation jaunt the other day, but all the newspapers insisted I was going to Los Angeles. The more I denied it, the more the papers said I was, so I did, just to help them in accuracy. I got lost in Texas, and there was a lot of bumpy weather. I got hungry, so I came down, and the Ladies' Aid Society was giving a chicken dinner in one little Texas town. Very thoughtful of them. As soon as I rolled down another Texas main street, a cowboy put his foot through my wing, and we had to mend it with a tablecloth. Well, I could not help but use that detail in the book if you happen to read the book. And so George did a great job of merchandising and branding her. She was a good writer, and she wrote a lot of pieces for women's magazines. She was the aeronautics editor of Cosmopolitan. I don't think they've had one ever since, but in any case, this was the line of travel attire that was generated. That's she modeling her clothing there. And this is the travel luggage that she and George generated as a designer luggage. And this is her designer label. I think it's really cool. I like that little red airplane going up there through the name. And then I ran across this. She says, smoking Lucky Strikes on the trip. Lucky Strikes are the cigarette that helped us on our friendship tour across the Atlantic. And the old, I can't quite make that out, but the gist of it is that she says that due to Lucky Strikes, they were able to calm their nerves. Apparently, the idea was that cigarettes help calm your nerves, which is an idea I remember even from my youth. So she was endorsing Lucky Strike. So at this point, after I'd read 4 or 5 biographies of her and a lot of her own writing, and I knew all this about her, I thought, I do not want to write another fictionalized biography of Amelia Earhart, So what am I going to do? And then I ran across the next year, 1929, they had the first women's Air Derby, which began in Santa Monica, and it was a race that ran all the way across the continent to Cleveland, and whoever got there first won. So it was, I started wondering, who are all these other pilots? What do we know about them? Do we know anything about them? What happened to them? Why aren't they famous? So I started looking into them, and this was the race that my own little teenage aviatrix here tells the salon that she gives a talk to that she is trying to qualify for the next year. So I looked at that's Eleanor Smith, one of the contestants, and that's her biography, actually, autobiography. So it turns out that many of them were semi-famous in the 30s, and this is Louise Thaden, who actually won that race for the next year, and I think Amelia Earhart came in third in that race, but she actually won the race. And that's when I saw Phoebe Amelie's face, I thought, she looks 12 years old. So I decided that my protagonist, my aviatrix, was going to be young. She was going to be a teenager. And then my question was, how in the world are we going to get a teenager to know how to fly and to be in possession of this airplane? And that became part of the mystery and the story of the novel. This is a biography of Phoebe Amelie. And this is kind of a glamour shot of Ruth Nichols, who was another contestant. And this is, I love this. Female stunt pilot and all-around badass, Helen Ritchie once had a long hole ripped in the fabric of her plane and wing 3 days into a long, grueling endurance flight. Rather than landing the plane, Ritchie instead climbed out on the wing with a needle and thread and laced the rent together and then climbed back into the cockpit. It's a wonderful story, but please, the needle and thread I just happen to have a needle and thread on me, and there's nobody else in the airplane, and I go out on the wing to do this, and meanwhile the airplane flies itself. But I think the story is indicative of the kind of mythological status these women had achieved by these flying these airplanes in that era. So they were sort of like, this is kind of like the George Washington and the cherry tree story. It's one of those myths that you begin to tell about heroes and heroines. This is Marvel Crossan. Marvel was the one fatality of the cross-country race. There were 20 who started the race and 12 who finished, and she was, as I said, the only fatality. And this is the story of what happened, is that it was thought that she bailed out of the plane. She was found with her parachute, but she was not opened. So for some reason, she bailed out of the plane. Another story I heard was that there was a crack in the manifold, the exhaust manifold, and the exhaust gases had come back into the cockpit and asphyxiated her and made her pass out, and that was the result of the crash. But Will Rogers dubbed the whole race the Powder Puff Derby. And that name stuck with that race for decades. Even when I was growing up, I used to hear, about the Powder Puff Derby? Well, the pilots, of course, hated that. It was very insulting, very patronizing. And the fact that somebody had to die in doing this is proof enough that it's very dangerous and daunting. The phrase Powder Puff Derby suggests to me that it's not a real race, like a man's race. It's a real race that's not as dangerous somehow, but that the truth is otherwise. Opal Coons, another one of the 20 contestants. This is one of the most colorful characters of the era, and that's Pancho Barnes, Florence Barnes. She was born a debutante in Los Angeles to a very wealthy family, and her mother wanted her to be a debutante, but she did not want to be a debutante, so she kept running away, but finally they sort of lassoed her in and married her to a minister who was about 15 years older than she, and they were said to have sex one time, and then it produced a son. And she sort of abandoned him. She ran off to Mexico and started flying planes there and had all kinds of exploits. And then during the late 20s and early 30s, she became a competitive stunt pilot and a pilot. And since she was in Los Angeles, she did a lot of film work, stunt piloting. And after World War II, she founded a sort of a resort, a ranch outside of Edwards Air Force Base in California and in the desert. And it was the place where all the test pilots like Chuck Yeager and the others would go for R&R, between their missions and their testing and on the weekends. And so she would go into Los Angeles and she would get these, young women to come out to be escorts for these pilots. So she was kind of accused of running a brothel, and it was never quite known whether she did or not, didn't. But this was the Happy Bottom Riding Club was the title of her ranch. And this is one of the many biographies written about her. There she is with Amelia Earhart, and we can't quite see that, but looks like Amelia Earhart won the race. This is the movie that was made about her, starring Valerie Bertinelli. And so you can see how dashing she is with her, her leather jacket and her white scarf like she's, in World War I. This is, I guess I can't scroll this, but I'll go to this next slide. This is Bessie Coleman, who's the first African-American woman to get a pilot's license. And she was a barnstormer during the 20s, and she actually was born in Waxahachie, but she grew up in Chicago. And she was not, of course, included in the race entrance because of her race. I noticed in the little film clips that we were watching before this that there's quite a bit of information about Catherine Stimson. She was the first woman to get a pilot's license in the United States at age 16. And she actually wanted to take piano lessons, and she thought that becoming a pilot would give her enough money to have piano lessons. So she became very well known all over the United States as someone who she invented the loop-de-loop. And she had two siblings who also got into the aeronautics business, and they formed a flying school in San Antonio. And there's a museum down in San Antonio right now that sort of honors her and her family and their exploits and their contributions to women's aviation. But to me, she looks, except for the ringlets, she looks so much like a schoolgirl. She looks very like she could be on a college campus right now. This was a kind of typical poster for the kind of air circus that my teenage aviatrix has grown up in, but has run away from. Her family was involved in these sort of daring exploits that are listed down there. Cars racing along and going from the car up to the airplane, from the plane down to the car, and walking on the wing and flying upside down and all these sorts of things. Her mother and her father and her mentor were all involved in that activity, and this is where she grew up, how she grew up. Kind of ferally, like homeschooling, but nobody really paid any attention to her schooling because they were always moving around and they played at county fairs, and it was a very peripatetic life, like a circus. This was D Magazine's vision of the setting of my book, and it's kind of impressionistic, and I really like it. What I really like about it is that the land is bland and the sky is alive, and that's I think that captures something about it that I've tried to capture in the book itself. So I've talked a lot about the aviatrix and the aviatrixes and the aviation that's behind it, but the other characters in the story were important to me too. And so when I wrote the novel, we have in our literature two kinds of tropes. One is, excuse me, stranger comes to town, which is the pilot coming to town, the stranger arriving and the townspeople. And the other is, it's the other way around. Person goes on a journey and stranger comes to town. So we get both sides. We get the person goes on a journey story from her point of view, and we get stranger comes to town from their point of view, how they react and respond and interact with her as she stays there in those few days. So this was a picture of my hometown about 1929. You'll see that there is one derrick, so the oil has already been discovered there. this becomes an important part of the story in the book. Excuse me, I got a little touch of laryngitis here. This is another view of the townscape. That's the only two-story building on the left there. That's the hotel. That's the post office on the right. One street. This is where my aviatrix lands when she comes in. I love this story. That's Carl's cot house. And they called these things hot cot houses because the oil workers needed a place to sleep. And so Carl would have this little shack set up, and you'd go in and you'd rent a few hours on a cot. And then you'd get up another man and come in and lie down on it. So that was why it was the hot cot house, because the cots were always hot, because someone was always sleeping in them. And it, looks like could be an Airbnb or something. I don't know. It's very, very rustic. This is a filling station, and maybe the only filling station. This is the hotel, once again. Traffic gathered around. I think these pictures were taken later than my idea of my story, because in my story, that discovery well is being drilled as the story goes on, and it comes in later in the story, and that's the first well that brings all of the boom to the town. So it's already happened here because we see the derrick's already been built. And here, this must be company housing. I grew up in company housing in this town. Every major oil company had its own encampment, housing that they had built for the employees. And I grew up in the Gulf camp, and I think this must have been an early one, because all these houses are exactly alike, and they have the very hopeful picket fences around them. I don't know what that's supposed to evoke, but maybe just keeps people out. Then this was an advertisement that appeared in Eastern newspapers, Southern newspapers. 500 Negro families, farmers preferred, to settle on free government lands in Chavez County, New Mexico. Blackdom, a Negro colony, fertile soil, ideal climate, no Jim Crow laws for information right. So two of the characters in my story, a white woman and a black man, they're in their 60s. They met and fell in love in Texas, but they could not have any kind of relationship to one another in the state of Texas. So when they became aware of this colony in New Mexico, I call it New Jordan in the story, they move out there, and this place it thrived for a while, but eventually it collapsed, and they had to move back down to some place where they wouldn't be very well seen or known, and that would be No Name, New Mexico, which is where my story takes place, this very small town. So this was the backdrop for how I came to have these two characters come to this place. Both of them have long histories with other people that when they met as I guess they would be called elderly at the time. They got together and have stayed together ever since. And this is a historical marker currently in New Mexico, honoring this town site and the lives that were lived there. So that's the backdrop of the novel. That's what I was thinking of when I was starting to write. I was thinking of that aviatrix and having grown up in that air circus, and at that time I didn't know why she left. I don't know why she took off in that airplane, and she made this emergency landing, and these people in the town had these relationships with her, and so that I was interested in all of that, the milieu and the town and the times. The times are very it's on the cusp of modernism and older cowboy culture country. And so the characters, there's one, Mabel, the school teacher, has an automobile, and there are horse-drawn carriages. There's no running water. There's no electricity. So all of the dwellings are primitive, like the way they were in the 20s. Although some of the houses have telephones, and I was trying to, build a time in history in America when we were right on the edge of being modern. So let me read a very brief, some passages from the opening. When we enter her story, our teenage aviatrix is flying an open cockpit biplane across the vastness of West Texas. We don't know where she has come from or where she's headed or even why she's going, but we learn that she's been on her flight for 3 days, that the aircraft is much newer and more powerful than what she's used to, and we see that she feels she's gained confidence in piloting it ever since. But then things get tricky. The day went hot, the air boisterous and rowdy, and the craft turned from a bird into a butterfly. No more straight ahead, steady as she goes, but up and down and sideways, a leap over here and over there like a drunken dancer. Then a wave upending her nose into a stall like a boxer taking an uppercut to the chin. A sudden elevator downdraft drop put her stomach in her throat, and a fist of fear clutched her heartbeats. And what had begun as a rude smudge like a bruise on the horizon now pushed rudely at her as she fought to keep the aircraft on a heading. Uh-oh. Curly, her mentor, liked to regale his compañeros about these big burly storms out here, and she could hear his voice. Oh, they're like a big, ugly, dirty iceberg in the sky, and you lost your DD paddle and the current's rushing you right into it. You can't go over it because it's just too darn tall, some of them 40,000 feet, and too damn, pardon my French, honey, wide to go around. So you're looking at how the bottom of that black mass seems nice and level and flat, about 7,000, 8,000 feet. And then you're figuring on just sort of gliding under it, but what you don't know is the updraft on those monsters can suck your little craft right up into its dark black heart and zoom you up like a scrap of paper in a whirlwind and spit you out way over whatever ceiling the specs on your craft might claim. And next thing you know, you're blacking out in a little coffin that's wrapped around you, headed straight down. And if you're lucky, you'll wake up soon enough to pull out and keep the nose from digging a 20-foot hole in Mother Earth. She'd never encountered a storm this huge. The ugly, dark stratocumulus like Himalayan peaks shooting up to, she couldn't guess the elevation, impossible to top them. The craft officially had a ceiling of 16,000 feet, and just like he said, the air there was far too thin to breathe and most likely only half the height of what she faced. And besides, oxygen hadn't made the list of things snatched up in her hasty departure. Then the headwind came hard at her, and not even that big J5 could do much more than just suspend the ship as it shoved against the front, marking time midair. Rain pelted her windscreen and drenched her. The airplane shook and shuddered, dipped and seesawed side to side, and it was only by the keychain Curly had hung from a knob on the panel that she knew she was right side up. It was crucial to keep the wings level and the craft from turning without her knowing. But lost inside the horrendous rain, without horizon or ground to judge by, she had to trust the turn indicator and her altimeter to stay aloft and true. Curly said he knew a pilot strapped a half-full pint of whiskey to the panel as a level, and when it started sloshing, when it started sloshing and turned useless, he drank it. The rain turned into stinging flecks of hail. Would it tear holes in the wings and elevator? Would she go down like a tattered kite? The upper wing shielded her a bit, but the prop wash peppered her with pellets of ice, and she was shivering terribly in her coveralls. Meanwhile, the needle on the fuel gauge had started tickling the empty bar. Holy malarkey, oh my dear Heavenly Father, please let me live through this. If you do, I'll turn myself in. The storm pummeled her on and on. She wrestled it like busting a bronc. And when at last she spied a glimmer in the west, she figured she'd fought her way to the backside. Within minutes, the air was sweet and calm and clear, cooler now from the rain, water on the wings and the windscreen glistening. Her breathing slowed, though she still trembled, and she banked right and left a bit to prove she was master now. Soon the air was friendly enough that she took big sloppy slugs from her water jug and ate an apple the farmer had blessed her with this morning. The storm was all behind her. She was drenched, but knew the warming air would dry her. Her compass showed that despite the tumbling and pitching, she still roughly hewed a southwesterly line. All seemed, if not well, at least a lot better. In fact, darn if she didn't feel a little bit, well, proud now. Darn, the story she could tell in the hangar lounge. beat a storm, a big storm, and lived to tell about it. She looked down to read the map. Gone. Flat blew out of her lap. Well, that railroad map wouldn't be much help now anyway. The flat terrain still lay as featureless as before, just a big brown table studded here and there with stunted trees. The dash clock showed she'd been aloft a little over 6 hours. The ship boasted a range of 650 miles and 67 gallons, but that depended on cruising consistently at 103. And though she pushed the craft along earlier, having bucked the headwind through the storm made it impossible to calculate how far she'd gone and how far she had to go before her next checkpoint, Pecos, Texas. Then she saw that the fuel gauge needle had laid its head down on the empty bar like it was a pillow. That's the part of the opening. So, anybody have any questions about anything?
I'll ask the first question.
Okay.
Is this your first book that you've written about, included about early aviation? And what were the challenges? Because that's a whole field by itself.
Mm-hmm. I was always interested in aviation. I never was a pilot. I always vividly remember that my dad, for my 12th birthday, ironically about the same year I heard about Amelia Earhart, my birthday present was a 20-minute ride in a Cessna that took off from a little airstrip we had in Hobbs. And I just, the images I got from, riding in that airplane at age 12 for the first time, seeing the world, the bird's eye view, was just something I don't think I ever got over it. So I built a lot of model airplanes, and I flew some, gas engine powered airplanes, and but I never did much about anything having to do personally. And I never wrote about aviation, but I think as you get older as a writer, things start bubbling up from your past that you feel that your creative mind has been working on for a long time. So almost every book I've written, that would be 14 as of the one that just came out this month, every book I've written has gone through a long process of generating in the back of my head, and then I decide to think about them consciously. So aviation was something I thought about for a long time, but I never wrote about it till now. I did a lot of research about how people fly planes and what it's like. And these guys who flew in these early aviators, the men and the women, they wrote a lot about it. They were real pleased with themselves about having done these things, and they liked to talk among themselves about it. And so a lot of them wrote a lot of books about it. So it's very easy to find a lot of firsthand accounts of experiences of going through the storm the way she does in the opening section. It was very easy to find that kind of material to use. So as a novel subject that needs to be researched, it was a dream because there was a lot of material there. It was easy to find, easy to get to, easy to access, interesting to read. So,
have you had any people who've heard about your book and said, "Oh, by the way, this is what happens to me all the time. I'll write an article for a magazine, and then as soon as it's published, well, if you ever do a reprint, think about what my uncle did over in this county or that county, or my aunt did to add to your article, like I'm going to reprint it." But have you had any of that experience of people writing and say, "Hey, oh, by the way, my grandfather was at that what was it called?
Blackdom.
Blackdom.
Yeah, interestingly enough, PBS did a documentary about that location. But what you said, I wondered when I heard the story about her gassing up in Hobbs. That photograph I showed early on, the men gathered around in the grocery store. That's something I discovered very recently. I didn't know how that happened. That's not the way it happens in my novel. There is no gas station in my town in the novel, so there's no way to stick a nozzle in the nose of the plane and fill her up. That gas has to be brought from somewhere else. But I happen to have a high school classmate who is still a Facebook friend. And when I started, advertising and talking about the book on Facebook, she happened to say, she said, "Oh, my aunt's grocery store was the one that filled her up." So I said, "Really, really?" I said, "What was her name?" She said, "Well, I don't know what her name was." I said, "Was it her store or was she must have been a child." So she did not have any information about it. So, but when I went digging around, I found this store, a picture of this store and the description of the Thompson grocery store. So that's how I came to know.
By the way, I want that Coke sign.
Yeah.
That is a classic photo.
Yeah. That's how I came to know that's the sort of thing that happens, because she had mentioned that to me. But,
did that stimulate some questions here? Comments, protests? There you go. I knew we'd have somebody. This is my favorite part when folks ask questions.
Your writing is absolutely beautiful. I mean, you get such a picture of what you're telling us. Were you an English major, or did all this wonderful talent come naturally, or how did that go?
Well, thank you for the compliments. I was a great reader as a kid, but I read magazines and the little comic strips from the bubblegum wrappers, and I read science fiction and I read popular mechanics, and I didn't. My high school experiences with literature were off-putting, because we read 19th century Victorian English literature like Silas Marner, and we read early colonial poets, Emerson and Thoreau. I mean, we read things that should be read, but I'm not sure be read by kids growing up in Hobbs, Mexico in the 1950s. So I pretty well ignored English as a subject in high school. In fact, when it came time to take the senior English, you could either take the senior English that would take you into college, or you could take the senior English that would take you into vocational or something. So I took the vocational. So this other guy and we built a guillotine for A Tale of Two Cities, instead of writing a paper, a research paper on it. So but when I got to North Texas as an undergraduate, I was originally a music major, and I started reading John Steinbeck and Faulkner and Hemingway, and Steinbeck particularly really struck me because I felt like I knew the people who were in those books. I had worked in the oil fields in the summers as a kid, and I grew up in West Texas and among people who were blue-collar people and oil workers. And so the characters who populated Steinbeck's novels, like Cannery Row and Of Mice and Men and so forth, they felt very familiar to me. And I had no idea a kind of literature could be made from that life and those kinds of lives. So I started taking more English classes that sort of steered me toward that kind of reading. And then I started wanting to imitate it. So I wanted to try to do it. So I did graduate with a degree in English, and I went on to a master's in English. I wrote my first novel. I guess I was 33 before my first novel was published, but I had started writing it in graduate school. So my process was contrary to what goes on now. I did not go to a graduate school that was like a Master's of Fine Arts. I didn't go to a writing program. I didn't go to a place where you had workshops, and I had never even met a famous writer until my first novel was published, and I was walking down the hallway at Viking Publishers in Madison Avenue, and there was a Ralph Nader on one side of the hallway and Nicholas von Hoffman on the other, and they were having a conversation. And Ralph Nader had become famous just prior to this for Unsafe at Any Speed, the book about the Chevrolet Corvette that was so dangerous. And Nicholas von Hoffman was a regular commentator on 60 Minutes, and I passed between them. These are the first famous people I ever saw in my life. And so I was very untutored. I guess I was kind of, I guess I was a hick. But I I learned my craft mostly by just reading and writing. I had great editors in the first several books that I wrote. I have my first editor at Viking had just graduated from Harvard. He'd been the editor of the Harvard Crimson, and he was fascinated by all things Texas. And he thought I was like some kind of wonder boy, cowboy author or something. And we had a great relationship, and we were together for 3 books. He went to Farrar Straus and took my second novel. He went to Athenaeum Scribner's and took my third novel. He and I, to this day, are Facebook friends, and he did some pro bono copy editing for me in this book that I've just been talking about. He was very good about, I've always been a sort of a wordy maximalist writer. You know, if one adjective is good, well, then 3 or 4 will even be better. And he just would go through, and he would kind of teach me, you don't really need to do that. So I sent him the copy of this manuscript, third or fourth draft, I think it was. I said, "Hey, Tom, take a look at this, will you?" And so he sent back about 15 pages that he'd done that to, and he said, "I guess you could see my point." I said, "Yeah, I get your point." So I went through and I cut 40 pages of adjectives and adjective phrases from the manuscript, and just made it a lot tighter. It was just, I don't know why I've always had that, habit of trying to say again and again and again what needs to be said. Does that help you? Thank you.
Cut out the right ones and kept the others. It was great.
I'm sorry?
You cut out the few and you kept the ones that really tell a nice story and make a picture.
Yeah. I mean, you always hope that's the right one anyway. It is until tomorrow.
One of the themes I recognize in the book is how it's kind of a transition between the old period and the new period. At the time that you wrote the book, I think it was 1928, aviation had only been around 18 years.
Right.
And so it was kind of a metaphor for how the old world was changing and the modern world was emerging. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's a real theme in the book, is this transience, change, and the kind of change that was coming. I think a really good example, I've got this young guy in the story, Leonard, and he's 19 years old. He's living with his uncle in this town. He's a kind of handyman. And he helps with cows, and he helps with windmills, and he helps the black man Otis in his blacksmith shop. And so he kind of a person among town that he's kind of their mascot, actually, I guess you'd say. And the teacher is interested in trying to get him to move beyond his present circumstances and take on challenges. But she imagines that he's interested in becoming a farmer or a rancher. And he hates livestock. He hates cows and he hates horses, and so his interest is in electricity. And the town has no electricity, but he reads in a magazine about something called a crystal set radio. And I remembered as a kid, I made a crystal set radio. And I remember how I did it, and I remember where I got the parts. All the parts came separately, and just they're pretty basic. You just need a crystal and a bunch of copper wire and paper tube and a headset and an antenna. So I thought, well, could he have done that in 1928? So one of the great things about the internet, these things were so hard to research before the internet. But I thought, okay, 1928, crystal set radio. So I'd Googled, 1928 crystal set radios. So I found that there was a government pamphlet that was issued to anyone who would send in to get it. The government wanted to promote radio, so they had the plans for making a crystal set radio that they were willing to send out to anybody who sent in. So he sent in for them. He got back the pamphlet, the brochure that showed, step by step how you build crystal set radio. I thought, well, how in the world is he going to get the parts? The parts are all described in the pamphlet and what they do and, how they hook up and so forth. Well, The 1928 Sears and Roebuck catalog, or the 1928 Montgomery Ward catalog, either one of them, is like available to you online, page by page, the way it came out to those people at that time. It's amazing. So you say, okay, 1928 Montgomery Ward catalog. There it is, right in front of you, right on your desktop. All you have to do is leaf through it and find it. So yes, I found all of the separate parts for that he would need. Fortunately, the inhabitants of this town collectively have a 1928 Montgomery Ward catalog, which they pass around among themselves and they order from. That comes through the mail. These things come through the mail. So he got it and he ordered the parts, and when they came in, he built the set, and he didn't know what to expect. And he puts on the earphones and starts scratching around, and he hears music. And it's astonishing to him because there's nowhere else in this town where there's any kind of music. There's a gramophone, the teacher has a gramophone, but to hear this music coming out of the air, it's like from a Shakespeare play or something, like they're in the woods and there's this wild music going on. And he's so enthralled by this that he runs out into the street and he keeps trying to get people to come listen to it because he has got a little piece of the future and he's dragged it back to this town. And he's sort of leaning forward into it, and he's sort of getting a sense of what it must be like to be out in that bigger world where these things are happening. And he gets so interested in this subject that he finally leaves town and goes to California, where he gets enrolled in an electronics school, electrical engineering school. And this is not part of the novel. This is just in my head after the novel. During the 30s, he gets involved in radar research. So when the war breaks out, he becomes a part of the Navy and part of the researching naval radar aboard ship. And after the war is over, he founds an electronics hobby shop called Radio Shack. And and he gets married and he has a big family. So for me, he was the future. And Katie is too, because she's a flyer. She's grown up in this really nascent world of aviation, and she is learning to be a part of it and trying to be a part of it. Of course, her gender and her sex prevent her from doing anything official. So she has a hard time getting beyond the unofficial part of just kind of flying a plane. And the fact that the oil comes at the end of the novel and brings the modern world to the town and pretty well completely ruins a lot of things about it. That's one of the themes that I've dealt with over and over and over in the books is the idea that a boom is a double-edged thing. And I think I was very much aware of this when I was writing the novel Buffalo Nickel, which is about oil discovery in Oklahoma as part of the basis of it. That once those wells were gushering and spilling oil out over everywhere, they would run into the oil would run into the creeks, and then the creeks would catch fire. So they would have these fiery creeks from oil. That's abominable. So the idea that modernity is a blessing is, for me, a kind of mixed thing in the histories of this town and of other places as well. Of course, they eventually will get electricity. They'll get paved streets. They'll get sewage systems. They'll get municipal government. They'll get bonds. They'll get schools. They'll get hospitals. That will happen, but it happens incrementally.
Any questions, comments? Surely there's a question. One more question. Come on, you got one. Come on, you got one. No bashfulness allowed here.
Well, I was, I don't know. I thought about buying the book, but I don't do that anymore because I rent them from the library. I get them online. So you're not offended?
I'm sorry?
Oh, okay. Well, great. Well, darn. shame on you, sir. I'll put that in your court. I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad everybody else is here.
Thanks for coming. I'm going to ask one more question.
Okay.
Mrs. McDermott, who was a benefactor of this library, and her husband was a co-founder of Texas Instruments. She had a big party out at her ranch in 1977, and that was given in honor of Lon Tinkle. And Lon Tinkle taught at SMU when he was there. And people from everywhere showed up for the party. Authors and journalists and so forth. The literary community showed up en masse. Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Lon Tinkle?
I've only got one little story, and that I was not a student when he was there at SMU. I knew him because he was a book editor and commentator at the Dallas Morning News, as well as being an SMU professor. At the time that was happening, I was a student in North Texas, just a regular, ordinary student. And I'd seen his picture in the paper, and I thought, well, I'm working on this novel. I've got this novel I'm working on. I mean, it was 78 pages long. It was about this, English major student who has this girlfriend who's also an English major student. It wasn't going anywhere, but it was, I thought it was really great. So I thought, well, one day maybe I'll finish it. I'll keep his name in mind because, I can send it to him or whatever. So I was making money as a musician playing with bands on the weekends. And I'd gone down to, I'd gone down to Waco to play a job with this band. And I was coming back on the bus, and I got to Dallas on the bus, and this was like, 1 o'clock in the morning. And then I think I had to wait till 2 or 3 o'clock to get on the bus to go to Denton. I had to take the bus to Denton. So I got on the bus, and I was passing down the aisle. And I saw this guy sitting there, and thought, oh, he looks like William Faulkner. I went and sat down. I thought, oh, you're crazy. That couldn't be William Faulkner. So I fought with myself, I don't know, forever about, whether or not I should go tell him, I'm a big fan of yours, Mr. Faulkner. I really loved your books. You had great influence on my writing and so forth. And, what's to lose? So I got up and I walked up to him and I poked him on the shoulder and I said, excuse me, are you William Faulkner? He said, no, but we share a distant kinship. It turned out it was Lon Tinkle, a book editor and columnist at the Dallas Morning News and professor at SMU. I said, oh, well, yes, I know you too. I'm very happy to meet you. And so they did share this resemblance. So he invited me to sit down next to him in the very short ride that we had to Denton. He was on his way to Oklahoma City or something to a conference. And so I started telling him about this book, I'm so embarrassed now to even imagine that I would be telling him about this stupid book. So then, cut to 10 years later, at least, my first novel had come out. And I sent him a letter and a copy of the book. And I said, I don't know if you remember me or not, but I met you on the bus and thought you were William Faulkner, and here, this is the copy of my first novel. And so he had it reviewed by Marshall Terry at SMU, and a very glowing review. It was a nice reception. The book won a couple of awards, and so Marshall Terry became actually my mentor at SMU. He hired me to come to SMU. So my connection with Lon is really sort of indirect. And that was my only one real experience with him was mistaking him for William Faulkner and telling me that, no, but we share a distant kinship. He had this real Southern accent, this patrician Southern accent. So, well, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Charlie Smith.